Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm glad you guys are here and on time. We will see how things go. I won't be surprised in the slightest if the door continues to open for the next 15 or 20 minutes.
You don't know what it took to get here on time.
This picture, by the way, is at Tel Dan. So from Dan to Beersheba, the northernmost city in Israel. It's a wilderness, or not wilderness, wildlife parks and rec, national park. That's what I'm looking for. It's a national park now, and people bring their families and they picnic there and stuff. And so that's where that picture was taken. Anyway, so let me start us off with prayer, and we will get going. Our Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. And this morning we're thankful for the land that you gave to your people that became this grand stage on which this narrative of your word plays out. Father, we pray that this morning as we are thinking about this land, that you will invite us into the story and that you will help to shape our minds around the way that it should influence our reading of the text. Lord, we pray for your blessing, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Steve, would you mind terribly running slides for me? I will tell you when. Of course, now I've given you a whole bunch of verses. Here, I'll read your verses. Or Christy doesn't have any verses. Would you mind running? Christy will do the slides.
Yes, I can do that. Just
All right. Oh, and interesting thing about this picture, the shoes that I'm wearing, I don't own. Those are my professor's shoes. I brought hiking boots, and that was it. And that didn't cut it for 3 weeks. So he let me borrow his shoes. He's a really tall guy, so we have the same size shoe. Okay, the first picture, the next picture after this, is an example of what's called a tell. So the way that a lot of archaeology works is a city will be built somewhere because there's good land or there's water nearby, there's good defenses, whatever it is that brings people to the region, they'll build a little settlement there. And then that settlement will eventually be destroyed or abandoned, and someone else will move in because it's still a desirable area, and they'll build a city on top of the old city. And then that city will get destroyed, and so someone will come in behind and build another one on top of that. And so what you get are layers of destruction. And so you start at the top, and the further back you go, or the further down you go, the further back in time you're going. And what it winds up looking like is just a big hill. And so this is Lachish. Lachish is the second most important city in the time of Hezekiah, second to Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem from the top of Lachish. So what you see sticking out here at the top is it's part of the wall that would have gone around the city. The top portion of Lachish dates to the period of Hezekiah. So when you're looking at this wall and up here, you're looking at stones that were placed there during the reign of Hezekiah, maybe just a little bit before that. Someone should have 2 Kings 18, verse 13 and 14. Does somebody have that? I know you're manning 6 verses.
In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me. The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold.
Okay. So this is, in Isaiah, we've been talking about the teacup poodle getting attacked by the Rottweilers, and then they call the grizzly bear Assyria, who comes in and swoops in from the north and lays siege to Jerusalem, and they fail to take Jerusalem. And Hezekiah is saying, please leave me alone. Well, at this point, Sennacherib has taken Lachish, the second most important city. You can see Jerusalem from Lachish. You can see Lachish from Jerusalem. So he's looking on the horizon, and he sees the largest army in the world. And he sends a letter and says, leave us alone. All right, let's go to the next one. We're changing sites now, but we're trying to get an idea of how archaeology works, because that's what I was in Israel to do. And then we'll go through a couple of different sites. This is a wall of a horse stable from Beersheba, and we're going to take a tour of Beersheba in a few minutes. But what you notice is the kind of uniform rectangular bricks on top, and then you have a layer of really smaller rocks, and then medium rocks. Do you see those 3 different layers? Those are 3 different periods of time. And so they're reusing the same city plan. They're building one wall on top of another, but when it gets knocked down or destroyed, they just come back and they build the wall there again, and then that wall gets knocked down, and they build the wall there again. And so you see this progression moving backwards in time. The rectangular bricks are the period of Hezekiah. And we're going to actually try to make a mental note of those rectangular bricks, because we're going to come back to that. The most of the time when you're doing archaeology, it's not treasure hunting. A lot of people think archaeology is like treasure hunting, or that's the really popular caricature of it. Indiana Jones, Tomb Raider, I don't know what other famous archaeologists are. But this idea that you have the Ark of the Covenant, we're going to go find the Ark of the Covenant, or we're going to go find the Holy Grail. That's not how it typically works. If you knew what was in the ground, you wouldn't have to dig. The reason you're digging is to learn whatever it is that you can learn. And so they'll take this this hill, and they will pick a fixed point on the hill and draw a grid. Every 5 meters, there's a line. So you have a bunch of little 5-meter squares. And if you could just imagine that being like an apple slicer, except in the shape of a grid, and you're just slicing the hill down, it winds up looking something like this. This is at Sepphoris. Sepphoris was the most important city in Galilee. You can see the hill, the city on the hill. Can you all make that out? That's Nazareth. So as Jesus is growing up, Sepphoris is being built from out of scratch. And Jesus, what does he do for a living? Carpenter, stonemason, builder. And 3 miles away, Sepphoris is being built. What do you think Jesus is doing as a teenager? I wouldn't be surprised if he had a hand in putting these stones together. But so you have this, what would otherwise be a level ground, and they are digging their way down, and they leave these walls. That's called a balk. That has nothing to do with walls of houses or walls of buildings. That's just the walls of the grid that they drew. So that when you're inside one of those squares, you can look on the balk and you can see there's dirt from here to here, there's ash, there's char, and then there's more dirt, so you know where you are in time as you go down. Does that make sense? We're all tracking? Okay. The way that you do archaeology, I had this caricature going into it that I was going to have a toothbrush or a paintbrush in my hands and be on my knees doing this 8 hours a day. And I thought that didn't sound real appealing. It's far more vigorous and back-breaking than that. When you're in one of these squares, you get 3 to 5 people working in each square. And you don't have them all running at once because you just don't have enough volunteers. Nobody ever does. And your basic tools are a pickaxe, a shovel, or a hoe, really, called a turia, and buckets. And you just use the pickaxe to churn up the ground and kind of loosen it, scrape it into the buckets, and carry it away to a dump site and make your own little tell. So as you're doing that, how do you know that you're not going to hit like a pot or something? If you're just hitting the ground with a pickaxe and you're trying to clear an area that's, say, 6 square feet, how do you know you're not just going to go right into a vessel or a bone or something? Well, you don't. And If you go to a museum where this is how they've excavated some things, sometimes you'll see a vessel that has a hole in it from where the pickaxe went straight through it. Or you'll wind up seeing something like this. This is also from Sepphoris. You'll see these kind of holes in the ground. This is a mosaic floor. This is a beautiful Roman period, slightly after the time of Jesus, mosaic. And as they're going along with their pickaxe, chunk, chunk, taking big holes out of it. And then they're scraping the dirt up and they see these flakes of mosaic stone. And they say, guys, hold on. We got to break out the toothbrush. And then they slow down and uncover the floor. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a shame that that part of that floor was lost. But it is what it is. I'll give you an example of an exceptional find, or what constitutes an exceptional find. This is Lance Hawley, my Old Testament professor. He was the guy that was teaching the class. And he is excavating a pot. So you can see, obviously it's not just dirt, but it's also not just rocks. You have smooth pieces of pottery, and you can see that circular rim of the pot. He and his team took 2 weeks to excavate that pot because they had to go so slowly and so carefully so that they didn't damage it while they were removing it. Gives you an idea of how quickly it doesn't move. All right, somebody has Psalm 31, verse 12, and someone has Jeremiah 48:38. And I hope it's not the same person with both. Psalm 31:12.
I am forgotten as a dead man, out of mind, I am like a broken vessel.
Jeremiah 48:38.
On all the housetops of Moab and in the streets there is lamentation everywhere, for I have broken Moab like an undesirable vessel, declares the Lord.
Okay, I've broken Moab like an undesirable vessel. So what's happened in this particular setting? This is also divided kingdom period. So we're talking between Solomon and Babylonian exile, somewhere in there. I don't know for sure. There was a wall on this left side before that drop-off. The base of that drop-off is Egyptian period. But there was a wall right there that apparently fell in while there were whole pots sitting there. And they just broke the vessels. And what do you do with a broken vessel? You bury it. You throw it away. You don't do anything with it. Because it's kind of like plastic. It's cheap and it's easy to make. Now, if you have a copper vessel, so for example, in Leviticus, there are all these instructions about if your vessel is defiled, what do you do? Well, if it's a copper vessel, you scour it. And if it's a clay vessel, you break it, throw it away, and get another one because it's cheap and easy to make. So, an example of an actual broken vessel. Now, what happens when you're scraping all of this dirt into your buckets, you'll see pieces of pottery all over the place. And you'll put them in buckets and into a separate pottery bucket that's labeled, this came from this location, and it's out of 25 buckets worth of dirt, this is how many pieces of pottery we found. So this one box is one part of one of those 5x5 squares from one day's worth of work. That's how much you find. And a normal day, if I had to guess, would produce about 500 potsherds. Because when you break a pot, you just throw it away. You have kind of the town dump of broken potsherds. And then someone comes in and wipes your city out, and they knock down all the walls. If they knock down the walls, they might choose to keep them and reuse them. But if they knock them down, they're not going to undo what they've just done. Instead, they just bury the town. They just go out and get some dirt and just pack it down. And they use that potsherd dump to help increase the volume. of their fill dirt. So you wind up finding pottery all over the place, and bone all over the place. Okay, somebody has Job 2, verses 7 and 8.
So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes.
There we go. Christy's going to show you a video, and I'm going to grab something out of my office that I forgot.
I also wanted to show you guys where I've been working for the last 2 weeks. This is our square. So everything from that tennis ball to a tennis ball up there somewhere. Oh, where that little red spot is, right in the center. That is the northern wall of our square. It's 5 meters by 5 meters. And this is the eastern wall of that temple that I was telling you about. This is the southern wall, and you can see where the wall has collapsed in. And so part of my team has been digging around those rocks and articulating it and making sure it's not a floor. And then someone has had to be back in this tiny little space trying to keep the walls level or straight and keep the floor level and dig all the way down. And today especially, I have been working in this room. We have no idea what this room would have been just yet. When we started, in 2 weeks we've done about 8.5 days worth of work. And when we started, the dirt was up to about here, and we've made it down that far. We didn't know that this rock was here when we started. And the way that we work is with a pickaxe. You churn up a section about 3 or 4 inches deep, and then you scrape it with a hoe into buckets. Take out any pottery that you find. This is the pottery that we found in just my section today. And you'll sift every so often the dirt that comes out just to make sure that you're not missing any pottery, which of course we always are, just a little bit. And that is how the excavation has been working. So, all right, that's all.
All right, and what I wanted to pass around are potsherds that we found from my square. About 95% of the sherds that you recover just get thrown away. Outside every excavation site, there will be a dump, probably a third of the size of this room, where they just take the day's finds and dump them. But before we dumped them, I grabbed some and stuck them in my bag. Okay, give you an idea, our team of 9 people were there for 2 weeks. There was another group from the University of Lethbridge in Canada. They were there for 4 weeks. And so between their 4 weeks and our 2 weeks, the whole site, we were working 5 squares. There were about 30 of us working. Okay, so you can get how many people are in this room? 5, about as many people as are in this room, working for basically 4 weeks. Here's what we produced. 153 of those red buckets of pottery, 28,358 potsherds of those. Some of them are the size of your thumbnail. Some of them are, a whole handle. We didn't weigh this, but based on the average weight of a bucket, we moved about 92,775 pounds of dirt, which is 15.5 elephants. We found 229 artifacts, which is just anything other than pottery that people have made, whether that's bronze or iron. And then we found 21 features, which would be a new wall or an altar, which after I filmed this video and we left, the rest of that Lethbridge group continued to dig in that square. And in the little temple section that you saw, they found a libation altar, or what they think is going to be a libation altar. They'll probably decide for sure next year, because you only dig for about a month every year. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions on archaeology and how that works?
How did they decide what fingernail size shards to keep versus, how did they decide?
Yeah, okay, so how do you know which shards to keep, since they're throwing away 95%? There are 4 archaeologists working our site. There's Dale Manor, who is the head of the Old Testament department at Harding in Searcy. There's the equivalent of Dale Manor in Lethbridge. And then there are 2 Israeli archaeologists, Shlomo and Zvi. And Shlomo spent 40 years apprenticing, learning how to read pottery. So you'll take your day's worth of pottery, you lay it out on a table. You have to wash it all by hand. You spend an hour and a half brushing to get all the dirt off. And then you lay it out on a table, and he will just come through and he looks at everything, and he can tell it's curved like this, it has this kind of rim, this is a Philistine pot, or this is a Mycenaean pot. And there is a science to it, but 40 years worth of study, he wasn't able to explain it all to us. He spent one lecture kind of saying, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm looking for, and here's what you're looking for when you're scraping in the square. But it's possible that we threw away something that would have been useful, but if you screen for every single piece, it'll take you 100 years to dig the site. But yeah, there is an expert on site who's reading the pottery to decide what's worth keeping and what isn't. And usually what's worth keeping is something that's either, if it's painted, you keep it. If it is out of chronological context, then you keep it. So for example, if you go to the bottom layer is 15th century BC, but you're digging up an 8th century BC, and you find a 15th century pot up here, well, why would that be the case? Why would you find a 15th century pot up in the 8th century? Because it's a family heirloom. Because it's something that's been held on to. 700 years, if it breaks, you just throw it away. If it's particularly valuable, then you will try to piece it back together and put it back on your mantle. Does that make sense? So things that are out of context historically, or that are Mycenaean is like early Greek, something that's been imported, you want to keep that. Or if you say, okay, we found half of a pot here, let's keep looking and see if we can find more pieces and maybe we can put together a whole vessel, then you'll keep it. Good question. Any other questions on archaeology? I know you didn't come with burning questions about archaeology. Let's talk about Beersheba. All of the people in our team, our class of 9, everybody had one site that they were responsible for becoming the resident expert on. So when we went to visit that site, then they would give the sort of a lecture or a walkthrough, even though it's their first time there. They've done enough reading on it ahead of time that they can say, all right, this has 15 layers that date all to these periods, and here are the interesting finds from this particular site. Well, my site was Beersheba. Have we heard of Beersheba? Okay, from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is the northernmost, Beersheba is the southernmost city in Israel. So let's take a look at the first picture. The whole site, this is the smallest site that we saw. It's the equivalent of about 2 football fields, 2.8 acres, and it has 9 layers. The earliest layer, well, there's Chalcolithic, so like pre-Abraham stuff. And then there's this huge jump up to, Iron 1. So you're talking period of the Judges. It just sits empty for that long. And then all of a sudden people start carving holes out of the bedrock to live in and to store their grain in. and then they start building houses. And then come the period of Solomon. Solomon builds this. This is dated to the 10th century BC, and it has a lot of common features. Beersheba means house of the well, well of the oath, or it can mean well of the seven, depends on what Sheva means. But Beersheba, every story in the Bible that you read about Beersheba has something to do with the well. This is the well. So surely someone is reading this. 1 Kings, Genesis 21, 25 to 31. Okay. It's really intimidating holding your phone out over this well to take a picture. Because if you drop it, you're not getting it back.
When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart.
Okay.
331.
331.
And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs who will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because they're both of them swore an oath.
Okay, so Abimelech and Abram meet at this well, and Abimelech is trying to take control of it, and Abraham gives him 7 lambs or 7 animals in exchange for Abimelech agreeing to say that Abraham dug this well. Now, I don't think that the text says that Abraham dug the well, just that Abimelech agrees to say that Abraham dug the well, which I don't put it past Abraham to do something like that. But this is the well that story is talking about. 225 feet deep, 22 stories down. Because this is in the middle of the desert. There is no water for miles. If you want water, you got to go down. And so this is one of the deepest wells that I know of.
What's the diameter?
I wish I could tell you, just from memory, it's probably about this big around.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the guy at the bottom of that thing.
Yeah, well, and it gets filled up at the end of the destruction. So as they're excavating, you had to have somebody in there with like a harness who's sending up buckets of dirt. I'm glad I wasn't that guy. Okay, let's go back to can you swipe to the right? Okay, this is the gate of the city. The well is it's right there. You come in, the governor's house is over here. These are the stables. You remember I showed you the wall with the rectangular bricks at the beginning? This is the wall with the rectangular bricks. Solomon builds this whole thing, and then it gets destroyed by Pharaoh Shishak in 926 BC. That's recorded in the Bible. The campaign of Pharaoh Shishak, who comes in and just waylays a lot of Judah. And then Judah regains control of it, and they rebuild, and they build on the same city plan, because it's a good city plan. And then it gets destroyed, and then they rebuild, and then it gets destroyed, and then they rebuild. Like 4 times they reused the same city plan, and that 4th time that it gets wiped out, they're like, forget it. Then they abandon it. Okay, so what you have are these 3, what's called a tripartite building. You see that? How you have 3 sort of columns. And then there are these little pillars. Those pillars would have been not only supporting the building, but they would have had a hole bored through them to tie up your horse. So you come in from town, you've been traveling from who knows where. Well, actually, not your horse, it would be your donkey. Horses are only for military. And you would come right into town. This is town square. And then you come drop off your donkey and unload whatever you've brought with you. That's what this building would have been used for. Now, do we have a verse for this, or do I need to explain it? Someone has 2 Kings 18, verses 1 through 4. This is my favorite thing about Beersheba. So don't read the wrong verse or something. 18, 1 through 4.
Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abi, and the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke to pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made for him. Until those days, the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan.
Okay. Hezekiah, good guy, bad guy? Good guy. Hezekiah is a good guy. He is one of the last good kings of Judah. And what the text that Jim just read tells us is that part of what makes him good is that he institutes these reforms. Because up until his day, people are sacrificing at the Asherahs, and they're sacrificing to the Baals. And so he goes in and clears out all of these altars and cuts down all these sacred trees to centralize worship in Jerusalem. Christy? Next one. Oh, next one. An altar. This altar, well, obviously you can see how big it is. Lance is a tall guy. Lance is a little bit taller than Wilson. But gives you an idea of the size of an altar. This is found in that stable in the wall with the rectangular bricks. The bricks of this wall had been stuffed. So, when Hezekiah is instituting his reforms, he goes over to the cult center, which is called the basement building now, and he breaks down the altar, and he takes the stones over to the place where the donkeys poop, and he puts it in the wall to desecrate the altar. And then as they're excavating, this is very close to the top, it's one of the first things they find. They're unearthing this wall, and they find these odd-shapen bricks that don't match the rest of the wall, and they're able to piece together, hey, this was an altar, and it dates to the period of Hezekiah. Is that cool? I think that's cool. Okay, let's go back to that spiral staircase. One of the things that Solomon did, this is, do I have the dimensions written down? It's a 60-foot drop. This is in one of the corners of the town. A 60-foot drop, about 45 feet square. I think that's right. And you walk all the way down to a tunnel. And the tunnel is 45 feet long. And at the end of the tunnel, what do you think is there? Guesses? A 45-foot, close. Cisterns, water. Now, you don't need the water because you have this well that's been there for 1,000 years by the time of Solomon. But what if your newly built city gets attacked? Because remember, he just builds the city from scratch. What happens if they have to shut the gates and the well is on the outside? You have to have water. So you would go down this little staircase, down the tunnel, and you have cisterns. There are, I think there were 5 cisterns that are each 18 feet by 36 feet deep. They hold 132,000 gallons of water hewn out of the bedrock by hand. And I didn't get any good pictures because it's underground, it's dark. Somebody got a picture of me, but it's just a picture of me. You don't care to see a picture of me. But how then do you fill the cistern? Yes. So you're not going over to the well and getting a bucket and bringing it and just tossing it down the hole. There's a feeder tunnel. So you go down your descent, and then you go down to this 45-foot tunnel to where these cisterns are. And on the other side of the cistern is a tunnel that goes outside the city to the river. And when it rains, the river rises, floods the tunnel, goes down into the cistern, fills the cistern, and you have water. You don't use this for your regular supply of water. This is emergency situations only. But imagine that you are under siege. You do need water. The gates are locked. Who do you send down to get the water? Whose job is it to get the water? It's the women. Why? Why do the women do this? Because men are lazy. Because men don't want to go down and get the water and carry it back, 8 pounds a gallon and carry it back up 65 feet. Okay. Any questions on Beersheba?
Why didn't they put the well in the city? Why didn't they just build their wall around that?
Yeah, so one of the reasons is hospitality. As people are traveling, again, there's no cities for miles. You're traveling and you want to water your sheep or your camels or whatever. You don't have to go into the city to do it. And even if you live there and you need to water your livestock, you don't want to have to bring your livestock into the city to water them. Good question, though. I had the same question. Anything else on Beersheba? All right, let's go on to Qumran. Has anyone heard of Qumran? It's not a biblical site, but it's still important for biblical studies. Does the name sound familiar? Okay. Let's go to the first picture here. What you see in the background, there's kind of this greenish, it's not really green, it's just kind of brownish, and then there's the horizon. That's the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea. Okay? Biblical. It's in your map at the back of your Bible. This is where Qumran sits in relation to the Dead Sea. This is looking southwest. Qumran, basically, around the time of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabean revolts, 2nd century BC, so before Jesus, after Malachi, in that period of silence, which is, there's a lot going on, as Jim always likes to point out. It's not silent. There's a group of priests and Levites in Jerusalem who are there around these revolts. People are trying to throw off the Greeks. Is it the Greeks? Maybe the Syrians. I don't remember off the top of my head. But there's a lot of violence happening, and Jerusalem is just kind of going down the tubes. The temple is being desecrated, and so these priests and Levites flee into the wilderness. I don't know why they didn't flee the other direction where there's water and food, but they flee into the wilderness where you've got the Salt Sea that you can't drink the water, and there's no food to be grown anywhere. And they start this little community. And they are going to be this beacon of piety because they realize God is going to waylay Jerusalem. Jerusalem's time is coming. We're not going to be there when it does. And we are going to be this pure remnant of Yahweh worship. And so they go to this, they build this. There's only one layer. They build this city, and there's probably 200 people, I think, if I remember right. So you understand why they're here? To get away from the corruption, be this beacon of purity. And one of the things that they do it's sort of like a Jewish monastery. It's very much like a Jewish monastery. One of the things that they do is they start copying scripts. So they leave Jerusalem and they take the Bible with them in all of its various scrolls, and they start copying the scrolls. And they write their own, the rule of the community, sort of like the Benedictine rule about this is how we live at Qumran. And a bunch of other we call them sect texts, but we don't need to get into that. We're not interested in that this morning. But what we're really interested in is they're copying these texts, the biblical texts. And those are the oldest versions of the Bible that we have. So sometimes if you have a Bible that makes mention of this, you'll see a footnote that says, this is the Masoretic text, Dead Sea Scrolls read, and then it'll give an alternative that the Dead Sea Scrolls have when they wrote it down. The Masoretic text, which is the base for your Old Testament, dates to like 900 or 1000 AD, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are at least 1,000 years earlier. And what they showed is that the Masoretic text was unbelievably accurate in retaining the original text. There are a few places where like the vowel gets changed or something like that. A weird reading gets kind of cleaned up, but 99% of the time, it's the same. So it's remarkable. Okay, what we're going to look at next is this room. Whoop, go back. Is this room. Okay, this is called the scriptorium, and you can show it to us now. This is the room where the Dead Sea Scrolls were copied. This is where it happened, which I think is really cool. Lance, my Old Testament professor, he said that seeing that room was the highlight of his trip. And it's not even that fascinating. It's just a big empty spot. But there were ink wells when they were uncovering it. So there's writing going on in this room. It's kind of cool to think that these, oh man. Okay, anyway. Go back again to our big shot. Okay, you see the tent with all the tourists standing under it? The next picture that we're going to look at is standing under that tent, looking to the right, looking looking west. Okay. Yep. So you can take this picture standing under that tent. That is what's called Cave 4. That is where they found the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So June 1st, 1954, the Wall Street Journal has this advertisement, classifieds. And it says this: biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. This is the most significant textual find of the last 1,000 years. And it's for sale in the Wall Street Journal. Some scholar stumbles upon this and says, wait. This isn't for sale. What had happened, there's a Bedouin shepherd who is out taking care of his sheep. One of the sheep wanders off into this cave, and he doesn't want to go in there because it's dark and scary, and so he just takes a rock and throws it in to try to scare the sheep out, and when the rock flies in, he hears the sound of a vessel breaking. And he thinks that's odd, so he goes in and finds these old scrolls that are preserved because of the dryness of the area. If it were more humid, it would have deteriorated. But because it's dry, these scrolls are preserved. He sees these and says, rich white people will pay lots of money for these. And he takes them back, and a few years later there's an ad in the Wall Street Journal. And as soon as people realize that there are scrolls around here, they start excavating, they find Qumran, and they start looking in all the other caves to see if there are any other scrolls. And there are. So far, I think there are at least 11 different caves that had jars of scrolls in them. This is cave number 4, which had 75% of all of the scrolls found were in this one cave. 15,000 manuscripts copied by hand were in this cave. 115 of them were biblical texts. Does anybody know what the only book of the Bible, of the Old Testament not found is at Qumran? Esther. Esther is the only one not found at Qumran. Few reasons people suggest. Maybe it's that it describes the founding of Purim, and they are way too buttoned down to celebrate Purim, because it's kind of like Halloween. Or maybe it doesn't mention God. It's not a very deeply theological text, and so maybe they just had no use for it. Or maybe they didn't get to it, and it was destroyed before they could. Okay, and then we'll...
That's a pretty long-legged sheep if I'm looking at that.
This is not the one where the Bedouin threw the sheep in.
Okay.
The Bedouin threw his rock into cave number 1.
Okay.
They're numbered in the order that they were found. Okay, so let's go to the next picture, back it up, same cave down at the bottom, gives you an idea of the kind of terrain that you're dealing with. And the rest of the caves, this is about as far south as it gets, but the rest of the caves, I think this is one right there.
Did you go any cave?
We did not. There's nothing there anymore anyway. So. Okay, 15 minutes left.
Hey, Parker.
Mm-hmm.
What's the thought on why they stashed it up on that hill in that cave?
Oh, because the Romans are coming. The Jerusalem falls in 70 AD, and they know they're toast. And so they take all of their stuff and they hide it just to preserve it. And in fact, it seems like, this is kind of conjecture, but it appears that someone from Qumran went 10 or 15 miles down the road to Masada, if you've heard of Masada, and he takes one of his scrolls with him. But maybe it was Esther. But yeah, the Masada falls in the year 72, I think. So Qumran just knows that they're going down, and so they start stashing their stuff because they know they're not going to survive. Okay, with the time we have left, I have three more sites, and not nearly enough time to cover them. So I will give you guys the choice. We can do Capernaum, Jerusalem, or Masada. I'm going to say you probably don't want to do Masada. I've only got about 4 pictures, and it's post-biblical. It's a really cool story, but it's just a cool story. So Jerusalem, Capernaum, or Masada, what say you? If you want to do Masada, I can do Masada.
I know, that's what I'm thinking too. Why do I have to choose?
Capernaum? Capernaum? All right, we'll do Capernaum, and then we'll see how fast we can move. All right, so next. Somebody has Matthew 8, 14 to 17. Just raise your hand if you have that one. Okay? And then someone else has Mark 4, 23. And someone else, Matthew 4, 23. Okay, Steve. And then Matthew 6, 5. Okay, so have those at the ready. Let's go to our next picture. This is an octagonal building. The rock part is. There's a church building that has been built on top of it that looks like a spaceship with legs. So it's hovering over this. It's a Catholic church on top. And the church on bottom, or the octagonal building, is a church from the 2nd, maybe the 3rd century that is built where Peter's house was. So if you went under this, you would be in Peter's house. Capernaum is not very big. There are only so many houses there. It's a very small fishing village. And this is the only house that showed sites of Christ worship in the 1st century. It stands to reason it's Peter's house. Matthew 8, 14 to 17.
And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases.
All right. In Peter's house. That's as good of a picture as I'm going to get for you. I can't take pictures of under the ground, but that's where it was. Okay, next picture. We'll zoom out a little bit. There's your spaceship church. There's a stairway to the right that leads up into it, and there's a glass floor so that you can look down into the building. I didn't go in because I'm not Catholic and because we were pushed for time, and I just really wasn't interested. So, anyway, there it is. Next. What?
So the church that was under that one that we saw is on top of Peter's house? Is that what
Yeah, so the spaceship church is hovering above a 2nd to 3rd century church, which is built on top of Peter's house.
Right. How do we know that that one is built on top of Peter's house?
Because we've excavated down enough to find that there is a house that it's built on top of that shows signs of Christ worship, 1st century. Okay, this is called the White Synagogue. This is a 4th century synagogue, so clear past the time of the Bible. But it gives you an idea of the way that a synagogue is laid out. You'll notice, okay, so this is, you walk in the back of the building, and this is what you see. There would have been up front the mercy seat, where the one reading the texts would sit. You would have had the ark that holds whatever texts that particular town happens to have. And obviously now it's in ruins. You can see the steel pipe right in the middle, and then one up in the corner that's holding it all in place so it doesn't tumble down on tourists. The men probably sit in the middle, and then the women are on the other side of the pillars around the outside. Christy, if you could show us the next one. Oh, I didn't put a picture in. There are benches sticking out of the wall. Now, this is on the outside of the White Synagogue. So you were just back here looking this way. Now you're outside. And what it's built on top of is a 1st century synagogue. And you notice it's not totally flush. It gets progressively more off as they build. At the end, it's probably 6 or 8 inches off. But 1st century synagogue in Capernaum. Guess who probably went in that building? And then down in the corner, you have a cobblestone ground, 1st century. Those are stones that Jesus would have walked on. So, Matthew 4:23.
And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people.
All right, Matthew 6:5.
And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward.
Okay. Anything else that I need to mention? Oh, the distance from Peter's house to the synagogue. Well, let's just watch the video. I have a video of Capernaum. Yep. And then tap it one more time. Welcome to Capernaum. What you see up here is a Catholic church that is built on top of an early church, 2nd, 3rd century, which commemorates the spot where Peter's house was. Peter's house didn't look like a big spaceship had landed on it. There's now a monastery / ticket office to get into Capernaum. Lots of masonry, including this mile marker on the Via Maris for Romans who would be moving merchandise from the north to the south. And so as Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he could very well have just pointed at this mile marker and said, if someone wants you to carry their load to the next marker, carry it twice. This is a 4th century synagogue which is built on the ruins of a 1st century synagogue which was paid for by a centurion who we read about in the Gospels. So distance from Peter's house to Capernaum, or from Peter's house to the synagogue, 30, 40 yards at most. Yeah, so when you're looking at Peter's house, on the other side is the sea. Yeah, real close. Because it's a fishing village.
And you can walk on those rocks, right?
On those, no. No, they have that fenced off. Probably more for safety than preservation. All right, other thoughts on Capernaum? Questions? Should we do Masada and then do Jerusalem separately some other time? Okay, let's skip forward to Masada. We'll see if we can do this in 5 minutes. Yeah, just go until you see the word Masada, Christy. I'm ruining all these pictures for you. There you go. That's exactly right. Whoop. Okay, Masada. So we're past the time of Jesus now. We're into the period where the Gospels are being written. Jerusalem falls in the year 70. And just before it falls, there's a group of Jewish rebels who flee the city just like Qumran did, but they're fleeing to live and not to preserve anything. They just want to survive. But before we get to Masada, let's go to the next picture. I want to give you an idea of the terrain. I wish this picture really captured the scope of it. I mean, you can see probably 20 miles, and it's just desert. It's over 100 degrees. That's the Dead Sea up at the top. You're now on the southern end of the Dead Sea. Qumran is closer up to the northern end. And in the beginning of the first century, maybe the end of the first century BC, so I think a little before Jesus, there's this guy named Herod the Great. Anyone heard of Herod the Great? He's the one that has the babies in Bethlehem killed. Herod is standing out by the sea, and he says, I want you to build me a fortress over there. And they look at the bottom of this mountain, and they say, right there. And he looks up at the top and says, no, right there. And it's this huge plateau that there's no water anywhere, there's no food anywhere, there's nothing for at least a dozen miles in any direction. And Herod says, I want a fortress right there. It's his southern fortress. He also has one at Caesarea Maritima. He also has Herodium. But this is his southern palace. And there's not, I think there's one, maybe two layers as they're excavating. There's the Herod layer and there's the Jewish rebel layer. So let's go to the next picture. As you're excavating, you're walking around. Oh, you can't really see it. All I really want you to see is this black line. Can you guys see this? Yeah. Okay. Everything below the line is original to Herod. And everything above the line is a reconstruction to give you an idea of what the city would have felt like. And that black line runs on everything all through the whole site. The frescoes at the bottom, that painted part, is done by, it's an Italian paint, which means that Herod is shipping someone in from Italy to paint his walls. Why not just use someone Jewish? Because he's Herod the Great, not Herod the Pretty Good. So he's going to call in someone from Italy to come do his stuff. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is what I really want you to see. This is a model, a sculpture of the whole thing. So the building that you could kind of see as we were looking out over that big expanse that was kind of hanging off the side of the building, that is right here. This whole thing would have been a fortress. Giving you an idea of the scope of it. I mean, I'm trying to think of something to compare it to. At least a dozen football fields.
So is that slide area, is that the access to that plateau?
We're going to get there.
That line?
Right here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. That's a big part of the story. Okay, so Herod builds this fortress, and he dies eventually because everybody does, and then it just sits empty because who wants to live out there other than Herod the Great? No one. So it just sits empty for 60, 65 years. Until Jerusalem is about to fall, you have 1,000 rebels from Jerusalem who flee. They know that there's this palace out there, and so they go to the palace and they just squat in Herod's old palace. There's plenty of room for all of them, 1,000 people. And they hang out for 5 or 6 years. There's a wall that goes all the way around. The Romans topple Jerusalem, and Masada is the last holdout. And then Rome has squashed the whole Jewish rebellion. So the Romans arrive at Masada, but how are you going to conquer Masada? It's like straight up. You can't just send soldiers up rock climbing. They've got all their gear, and the rebels are just going to throw rocks over the wall and knock them off. How do you get up there? You build a ramp. And so for years, for like 4 years, I think, the Romans have this little camp. We'll show you the next picture. This is the camp that you can see standing in Masada looking over the wall. They're just right there. Actually, go back to the model. This is the model of the camp. Okay, and then the next picture was the real thing. They just get their wheelbarrows, and just one wheelbarrow at a time, they build this ramp, fill in the valley until they can bring their siege work up to the door and break in. The rebels know that their time is running out. They know that the Romans are getting close, and the night before they breach the walls, the elders of this little community gather together, and they say, "We do not want our wives to be abused. We do not want our children to become slaves. What do we do?" What do you think they did? They killed them. The elders take a sword and they go around and they murder their own families and their neighbors until it's just the 10 of them. And then they draw lots to decide who among them is going to die next. And then the last guy standing, Ben-Gurion, or no, not Ben-Gurion, forget his name. Ben-Gurion is the name of the airport. The last guy standing kills number 2, and he kills himself. The next morning, the Romans break in, and there's 1,000 dead bodies. And there's plenty of food left. They didn't kill themselves because they were out of supplies. It was just a big to Rome. Yeah, exactly. Take away the pleasure of the victory. One of the guys didn't have it in him to kill his wife and his children. And so, back to our model, there are these, I think it's on the other side, there is the sort of snake-like aqueduct, so that when the rain comes in, it must be on this side, the rain comes in and fills these little cisterns that are hewn out of the side of the hill. This one guy who couldn't do it hid his wife and children in one of these cisterns. And so they lived to tell the tale. That's how we know what the decision was. And one of the most remarkable finds is they found the lots that were cast. They found 10 little potsherds with Hebrew names written on them, and they found the one that Josephus tells us was the name of the guy that killed himself. And they're on display in a museum now. Okay, then we only had one more picture after this. This used to be Herod's stables. The Jewish rebels turned it into a synagogue, and this is where the leaders meet to cast lots and decide how they're going to go about it.
So you walked the rooms where Jesus is studying,
We certainly walked on floors where Jesus would have walked.
isn't that cool to say that?
Yeah. Yeah. You don't really walk into rooms where Jesus would have been because the walls fall down. But the floors and the ground, yes, absolutely. And in Jerusalem, there's a lot of that. In fact, there's so much in Jerusalem that you almost kind of get tired of it. Because it's like, oh, so he walked here, and he touched that, and he walked over here. Okay. What it does is it reminds you that Jesus is a real person. He's not an idea, and he's not just an enthroned Lord, but he's also a person in a context, first century Judaism. Okay, thank you all for being here. Wilson, you're on to teach next week What do you want to do? Do we want to do Jerusalem next week? That would cut into your lesson. I don't know if you have anything planned. Or I don't have anything planned for tonight. But I know not everybody is here on Sunday nights, and so...
I'd say let's do it next week.
Next week?
I can condense mine 3 weeks into 2 weeks.
Okay. So next week, 8:59, we're going to talk about Jerusalem.
And not a minute later.
And not a minute later. And it's potluck.